Thank you very much. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Lynn Nesbitt, and I'll be chairing today's panel. Joining me on the panel via Zoom are Gail Anderson and Carrie Linklater. Our administrative personnel is Crystal Harland, and our assessor is Sharon Tang. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment goal in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I'll confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony, followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will hear items 1 through 7 on our docket today. Mrs. Harland, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Yes, Madam Chair. Madam Assessor, would you please state your full name?
Sharon Tang.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mark Newman.
Thank you for standing. Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hello, Ms. Tang and Mr. Newman.
Good afternoon to all.
Let's get started right away with item number 1 on our agenda. That's file number 24-3125. So Ms. Tang, when you are ready, please.
File number is 24-3125. Roll number is 0500937510. Address is 50 Ridgecrest Avenue. The assessed value for 2025 is $23,427,000. There is one building on the property with 6 stories. The building was built in 2012. There are 173 suites and 46 outdoor parking. Page 2 and 3 of my brief shows the subject property photos and locations. And page 4 shows that there has been no sales history 3 years prior to the effective date of the report. Page 5 shows the workup valuation. So there are 158 one-bedroom, 15 two-bedrooms. And then we assign an average monthly rent of $1,199.93. Then we use 3% vacancy, 49.1% expense ratio, and 5.25% cap rate. And that gives us $23,427,000. Page 6 of my brief shows the comparable rent for the subject property and the map. Page 7 to page 8 of my brief shows the CMHC information. I would like to point out that on page 8, bottom page 8, it shows October 2023 information when it was supposed to be October 22. So the difference in the rent is about $50 to about $100 difference. Depends on the suite type. So the actual rent for October 2022 for 100 unit plus is $897 for bachelor suites, and for one bedroom is $1,171, and for two bedroom is $1,443. And page 9 and 10 of my brief shows the cap rate studies, and page 16 shows the subject property income and expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Chang. Mr. Newman.
That is a very efficient presentation, Ms. Tang, I have to tell you. Thank you. I'll try and be as efficient. Let's jump ahead, I guess, to page 9 for a moment. That's your cap rate page. And of course, that's the chart that the department presents on all hearings. But focusing on multifamily, is it fair to say that part of what the department does is it surveys the brokers and it reflects the information the brokers are providing for each type of property?
That's correct.
And so obviously the department is familiar with the broker's reports, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So then if we come back to page 2, there's a listing of scope of work. And I will say it's not something that I commonly see in reports, but noting it, if you look at item 6, a review of reported lease rates, reported revenues, and reported operating expenses for similar properties in the marketplace. Were there actually any similar properties that you were able to look at?
Not for this particular property. We put the scope on all the, I guess, on all the briefs. But I mean, we do look at the information, but we don't take into consideration of this particular property type just because the property is assisted living facility. So we don't take into consideration of their income and expenses.
Okay, and just so I'm clear, what you're saying ultimately is there was no information you could gather from similar properties to this subject, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And similarly, your item 7, a review of comparable property sales. Is it correct to say that there were no sales of similar equivalent properties that you were able to look at?
That is correct.
Okay. And your item 1 says you've looked at assessment records for the subject property. Does that include reviewing past decisions of these boards from prior cycles to see how they've handled these types of properties?
I just reviewed them briefly, but I don't remember too much details.
All right. So let's look at your page 5. Is everything on your page 5 model generated?
It is.
Okay. And so on this property, the capitalization rate is 5.25%. And we're going to do 6 other properties today, and we're going to look at the cap rates on each of those properties as we go through it. But do you have in mind that on 5 of the properties, the cap rates are 5.25, and on 2 others, they're slightly different?
No.
Okay, fair enough. So everything then on page 5 is model generated. You didn't select the rent, you didn't select the vacancy or the expense ratio or the capitalization rate, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And as you've noted at the top of page 5, there's 158 one-bedrooms and there's 15 two-bedrooms. And I've done the math, and I'll suggest to you that slightly over 91% of the units are one bedroom and just under 9% are two bedroom. Then let's jump ahead to your page 6. So a variety of information about the comparables and about the subject property. So if we look down the subject property column, we see it was built in 2012, as you've noted. We see the number of one bedrooms at 158 and the twos at 15, as we just discussed. We see the gross floor area, and we see the gross floor area per unit. And so for the subject, it's 883 square feet, correct?
That's correct.
And then for all the comparables, you have essentially the same data, which is the mix of suites, bachelor's ones, twos, threes, as the case may be. You've also got the square footage, the gross floor area per unit for each of the comparables, correct?
That's correct.
And do we agree, I take it, that the subject compared to the comparables on a gross floor area is, I'll suggest to you, significantly smaller in the range of, let's say, 15%, perhaps even a bit more depending on the property, but the subject is smaller on a gross floor area basis, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then similarly, and I've done the math, and I don't want to bog us down in the math, but do you agree with me that comparable 2 and comparable 4 are 100% two bedrooms?
That is correct. So I know that the suite mix is not the best comparison. I was focusing more on the price per square footage. So the subject property is about $1.36 per square foot, and the comparable range between $1.11 to $1.39 per square foot. So the rent per square foot does support the subject property.
So, all right, but let's keep going. So again, you're acknowledging the suite mix of these comparables really isn't comparable, and you talked about the rate per square foot. Of course, the more two-bedroom units you have, the more three-bedroom units you have, the more rent the property is going to generate, correct?
Because the area is bigger. That is correct.
Oh,
I mean, the
well,
size of the units would be bigger.
well, yes, perhaps for that reason, but there's another reason. Two bedrooms rent for more than one bedrooms do, don't they?
They do.
Right. And so if you have more two bedrooms than one bedrooms, then the landlord has a greater income potential because of the suite mix, correct?
Overall, that is correct.
All right. And these comparables, did the model generate them, select them?
No, I select them myself.
Okay, so here's what I'd like to understand. Well, let me ask another question first. All of the comparables have full kitchens, correct?
That's correct.
They'll have a stove, they'll have a fridge, they'll have a dishwasher, perhaps a garburator, but they will have full kitchens, correct?
That is correct.
The subject property, indeed, all the subject properties we're going to deal with today do not have full kitchens, do they?
No, they don't.
Okay. And so I think what we've established thus far is that on a comparative basis, the subject is smaller in size to all the comparables, correct?
Per unit size, that is correct. But compared to the comparables, the subject property also have a lot more common areas that we believe adding values to the property itself. So it kind of write off the fact it doesn't have a kitchen. So it's just like a regular apartment. If a regular apartment has a gym versus apartment that doesn't have a gym, the apartment with the gym that would rent more compared to the apartment doesn't have the gym. So now the subject property doesn't have the kitchen or the full kitchen per se compared to the comparables, but it does have those added amenities to write off the fact it doesn't have the kitchen.
Well, there's a presumption in the answer you just gave. And that presumption is that those amenities that you talk about, those common areas, they actually add value to the real estate. And I'll suggest to you they don't. I'll suggest to you, and this is really at the heart of the issue for the panel ultimately, these independent living facilities, what they sell to the occupants is a combination of a unit that the occupants can live in, plus what I'll call board. So if you phrase it as room and board, you get the room, the apartment unit, but you also get all of your food and meals, correct?
That's correct.
You also get activities that are organized and made available, correct?
That's correct.
Some level, potential level of medical care or assistance, depending on the type of facility and the type of unit that you're occupying, correct?
That's correct.
And the assessor, when doing a valuation, the assessor can't put a value on the meals, correct?
That's correct.
Because the assessor can only value the land and building. Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. And so at the end of the day, the problem for the department and for the panel and for me is how do we get rent that you can use to compare, because you can't use the actual rents that are being paid by the occupants because they include a variety of other activities, the supply of a variety of other items. Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. So then, if we jump ahead to your page 7 and 8, there is CMHC data. And page 7 is the average apartment rents by unit type, bachelor 1, 2, or 3 bedroom, by geographic area, which is called a zone, correct?
That's correct.
And so the subject property is in zone 6, West Kildonan, correct?
That's correct.
Then your page 8, the top half, that is CMHC data by year of construction. Agreed?
Yes.
And so this property is built in 2012. So it would fall into that category, 2005 to 2014. And across the line are the average rents based on those years of construction.
That's correct.
All right. And then the bottom half of page 8, and I know you made a correction, that is data based on the size of the building.
That's correct.
How many units are there in the building? And because there are more than 100 units in this building, we would look across that line, but you've corrected that to reduce the amounts for the 1 and 2 bedrooms. The 1243 and the 1 bedroom comes down to 1171, and the 1534 comes down to 1443.
That's correct.
Okay. So we have this data gathered by CMHC. And of course, the data CMHC has gathered is data for what I'm going to call regular apartments. Right?
That's correct.
Yes. It's not independent living facilities without kitchens. it's regular apartments, agreed?
Yes.
Okay. So if we then come back to your page 5. So this is the model generated value. Do you know how the model is built? Do you know how the model actually is constructed and what sample or what types of properties go into it?
No.
Okay. But I'll suggest to you and ask that the capitalization rate that the model is extracting is for what I will call typical apartment buildings with kitchens. Agreed?
Yes.
So this is not a cap rate for this type of property. Agreed?
That's correct.
Did you search out information for capitalization rates for this type of property?
We don't have any data for the assisted living facilities for sale in our sales database, so we don't so we don't have any information.
All right. Did you look to the brokers to see if any of them report data for independent living facilities that you could look to assist?
I think some brokers have the information, but that information is based on the sales from a different province. So we do look at those information. I don't know exactly how much we rely on those information.
And would you agree with me that newer built apartment buildings and your comparables on this property, I'll suggest, are of that type, that typically the kitchens have dishwashers?
Yes,
And do you agree with me that frequently these newer built buildings charging higher rents also have a washer and dryer in the unit?
I assume so.
I mean, I can tell you, I went and searched out the comparables and reviewed from their website the amenities they have. And I'll suggest to you that they do include washer and dryer, but I accept your answer. Of course, the subject units do not have a washer and dryer, do they?
Not in suites, but I think will be in the building.
But the rents that are being paid by your comparables on page 6, they're going to include a full kitchen, a washer and dryer, and a bigger unit. Agreed?
That's correct.
And your brief contains at page 10, and you didn't speak about it, a list of capitalization rates. My understanding is that this list is only intended to show that the model is reasonably constructed. It's not intended to identify a capitalization rate for the subject property. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And to be clear, none of these properties listed on your page 10 is an independent living facility, is it?
That is correct.
And again, to be clear, on your page 5, the average model rent of $1,199 is generated by the model, correct?
That's correct.
And the model is constructed of properties that are typical apartment buildings, unlike the subject, correct?
That's correct.
I think those are my questions. And as I said to the panel, I took a little bit more time here. I won't repeat it.
Thank you very much. Ms. Anderson, do you have questions for the assessor?
I do, thank you. In regards to the subject property, there's 46 parking spots. I'm wondering how that's considered in the value of the property.
So I think we do take into consideration of the parking revenue, and then we spread it out into per suite basis. So the total of $1,199.93, that already includes the parking revenue.
Okay, thank you. And so on page 6 with your comparables then, you don't indicate whether those rental rates include parking, or do you know if they do or not?
These ones will just be the net rent, so the rent doesn't include parking.
Okay. Okay, and in your comparables, only comparable 1 includes heat in the rent, correct?
That's correct.
And the subject property, would heat be included?
Not in the rent that we assigned.
Okay. Okay. And do you know if any of the comparables that you have provided on page 6, if they're 55 plus units, like I know they wouldn't be assisted living, but do you know if they're 55 plus units that would have, you know, the wider hallways, some of the grab bars, activity rooms in them? Do you know if they are any of them?
Not I'm aware of. So when we are valuing these senior assistant living facilities or 55 plus facilities, we do treat them as a regular apartment building. So the rent comparables we're finding are just the regular apartment buildings. We don't have any rent comparables for 55 plus. Those will be considered as not market rent as well. So we don't include them for the comparables.
Okay. Okay, those are all my questions. Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions for the assessor?
I do, thank you, Madam Chair, just one. So Ms. Tang, just to establish, this is a 55 plus building, correct?
Yes.
All right, so would you agree that there is more of an inherent risk due to that restriction? And I'm just going to further say, you've got a smaller part of the population to pick from who want these apartments in these buildings, and you're comparing them to just regular apartments that anybody could go into.
I think there's a high demand for these kind of properties. I know there has been new 55 plus facilities being built across the city. So I don't think that there's a shortage for demand or increasing risks. I think.
Okay, I'm just gonna
Okay.
ask you then, do you have any data on that?
We have had a few newer properties for appeals, but I don't have the exact number on regarding to how many, like exactly how many numbers are being built.
All right, I thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you. And just to sort of build on that, Ms. Tang, this isn't just a 55 plus building, it's a 55 plus building that's got the assisted living component, right?
That is correct.
So it's when you say that there is high demand, did you refer to 55 plus buildings or 55 plus assisted living buildings?
Well, from the appeals I've had before, those ones are the 55 plus with assisted living portion as well. But like I said, I don't know the exact data for
Okay.
the actual numbers.
And I think Mr. Newman had asked you about this value is model, right? So that 3% vacancy, have you done any analysis on or looked at the actual vacancies for these types of properties to see if that market vacancy is reasonable?
No, like I said, we are treating these properties as regular apartment buildings, so we
Okay.
didn't look into the actual data.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Ms. Chang. Mr. Newman. I
Thank
think you indicated that you would like to do a overarching statement first and
yes.
then, okay, thank you.
So, and I think you can tell from my questions and the responses, and indeed, if the very last thing the assessor said, we treat as a regular apartment building. And that's really the heart of the problem. And I anticipate that all of you have likely been in a facility of this type to visit. Perhaps have been in one of the properties that's on the docket today. But obviously they provide and meet a special need, and that's why they're in the market. And they not only do they cater to 55 plus, and indeed I would dare say I think there's probably relatively few 55-year-olds in these facilities unless they've got a care need that needs to be addressed. I think the age actually tends to be much higher. And because of that, what it leads to is significant turnover because people either go to hospital or they pass away regrettably. But that's what happens in these facilities. And so you can tell from the questions that I've asked that there are a couple of issues that are going to arise in each and every one of them, but not all of them. So the rent, for example, is an issue in this one, but it's not in a couple of the others. And so I will ask you to keep in mind as we go through them, how come the model generates such different rents depending on the property? The vacancies, I have looked at actual, and you'll hear me make comments about that. I've looked at expense ratios. You'll hear me make comments about that, although I have accepted many of them. And of course, ultimately, a significant issue is the capitalization rate. And you'll see me and hear me present evidence. The brokers actually do track this information. They do track capitalization rate for independent living facilities. And I think at a minimum, the assessor should be looking at it. But I think what's important to extract from the evidence you've heard already is that clearly everything in the model is driven by typical apartment buildings. And the subjects are not. So with that by way of overview, let me go to page 2 of my brief. And in all these briefs, you're going to find some information that repeats. Again, I will cover it in detail the first time. I won't repeat the detail on subsequent ones. So this property, as we've heard, 173 units. From a size perspective, they're not huge. And someone asked the question about hallways and whether they're wider. And the answer is they are, because many of the residents have mobility aids and they need more room to get around. They also typically have, and let me also mention to the panel, I have been in each and every one of the facilities that is on the docket today. I've been through them. The washrooms in these facilities are larger. In fact, they're disproportionately sized relative to the rest of the unit. Because again, frequently the residents have mobility issues, they need more room to maneuver. And so more of the space goes into the washroom than would be the case in a typical unit. The managers of these businesses tell me that it's typical that an average of 30% of the units will turn over each year. And so how do we value these things? And I've been doing these for a long time, and I make reference to the fact that the municipal board actually heard 3 cases involving these properties, going back a lot of years, because there was a lot of confusion early on. How do we do these things? How do we get out of the rents that are actually charged to the occupants? How do we get those non-accessible elements of meals and activities and transport to activities and supportive care? How do we get all of that out of the dollars paid each month by an occupant? And ultimately, what was settled upon, and there's an article I've attached that speaks to this about, and it's referenced at the top of page 3, assessing congregate care facilities, a unique problem and valuation. How do they get to it? So at page 3, I reference some of the things I've already said to you. These are not traditional apartment buildings. Therefore, I say to you simply, they can't be modeled based on apartment buildings, which is what the assessor has done. They don't operate as traditional apartment buildings. They've got smaller sized apartments without stoves. They've got wider hallways with handrails, wider doorways to accommodate older, more frail residents, sometimes with walkers. They've got safety amenities, not typically found in apartment buildings, including handrails and intercoms. They've got communal dining rooms, typically not found in apartment buildings. And the assessor says, well, we treat the communal area as being the equivalent of having a stove, for example. They offset each other. So we can look to the rents, I think she's saying, for other apartment buildings. And I say to you, that's not the case, because those communal areas, they wouldn't be there but for the business model that's there. Apartment buildings are not built with those communal areas. Activity rooms, not typically found in older apartment buildings, but more and more available in newer apartment buildings. And so what's happened, what the developers have done, is because they see their way to generate additional profit, get more apartment units onto each site. And the way you get more units on each site is to make them smaller. So you get higher density, but they're smaller, but you can't pile people into small units. You've got to give them some more room. So what they tend to do in the newer buildings is they put in a party room, a gym. Sometimes the party room will be relatively elaborate and it will have kitchen facilities. If you want to have a dozen people in for dinner, you can go down to the kitchen equipped party room and you can cook and serve them dinner. That's what they do in the newer buildings. And the comparables for this property are all newer buildings with more elaborate amenities of that type. A chapel, sometimes a small convenience store, indoor and or outdoor parking. I'll just pause to observe 46 stalls in this place. You can't build an apartment building today with 173 units with only 43 or 46 parking stalls. Why? Why can they do it here? Because, sadly, a lot of them don't drive anymore. So there aren't that many cars. But you cannot build an apartment building with only that few stalls, essentially almost one stall for every 4 units. You can't get away with that. The city won't let you. 24-hour staffing with medically supportive personnel, housekeeping services, laundry services, and there's an activity coordinator. That's what these places are about. Very different animal than a traditional apartment building. So how do we determine the rents? So at the bottom of page 4, there's a reference to that, or a quote from that article I referenced earlier. And you've got to figure out what the economic rent is. Doesn't matter what the rent is stated to be, because the rent is for the package of benefits, not just the housing. And the rate is best determined by using comparable alternative housing, such as retirement communities or comparable apartment buildings. And I will tell you that there are some independent living facilities that do have full kitchens. And those developers have made the business decision that if for whatever reason, the independent living model doesn't work, or it could be more profitable if we converted it to a traditional apartment building, it's there, it's equipped. These units in these buildings, they don't even have the wiring to handle a stove. They don't have the wiring to handle a dryer. And those two items need higher electrical capacity in order for them to work. So as the assessors told us, $1,199.93. We don't accept that. We think that's too high. So what we do is we go to CMHC as our starting point. And I'll show you that in a moment on the next page. But we go to CMHC October 2022 report, and then we make an adjustment. Because we make an adjustment for the fact that they're different. And in this case, we've made a 20% adjustment. And I asked the assessor whether she went back and looked at how these properties have been handled in prior appeals, because this is the methodology that I have been using for multiple cycles. I've done all of these buildings since they first opened. This is the methodology I have used cycle after cycle. It's really the same issues that are arising over and over again. So if you look at page 6, here I've given you at the top of the page a chart that's got the rents from CMHC October of 2022 with the relevant rents. My records, the property records indicate that there is a single 3-bedroom unit here. So that's why I put the 3-bedroom unit information in. We'll get to that, but you can see what the average rents are. So if you look at the 3 criteria, geographic area, West Kildonan, year of construction, size of the building, number of units, there's the 3 metrics in the middle of the page. And that's the average of those 3 items. So $1,221 is the average rent for ones and $1,503 for twos. But that, of course, is for traditional, fully equipped apartments. It's not for properties like the subject. And so what I have done, as I told you, is I have made an adjustment of 20% to take into account that traditionally in these higher end buildings, there's a full kitchen, there's a washer and dryer. There are these types of items are found in these units, but they're not found in the subject unit. And so that then leads me to a gross potential income of $2,068,000 compared to the assessor's $2,491,000. So that's the first point of decision, if I can use that term, that you're going to have to make. Vacancy. Page 7, the assessors allowed 3%. And I've given you the vacancy history for the property. And you can see it's much higher than 3%. And you can see that in 2012 and 2021 and 2022, their vacancy was higher. In part, that was COVID. People did not want to come. Residents fled these facilities to some extent because, of course, it's a communal model. So there was great concern about that. I've set the vacancy at 7%. I've tried to be reasonably conservative, notwithstanding the 12s in 2021 and 2022. And that, of course, then brings down the effective gross income. Expenses. I'll show you an expense chart in a moment. 49.1% used by the assessor. I'm stabilizing at 52%. I'm telling you at the top of page 8 that the 2021 expenses were 52.54% of the effective gross income I'm using, to be clear. And 57.11% of the 2022. It's the same effective gross income, but the expenses vary in those years. I'm selecting 52%, and I'll show you the chart that details all of that. COVID, I speak a bit about COVID. Suffice it to say that COVID had an impact in these types of facilities, regrettably. So then I move on to cap rate at page 9. So the city's manual says that cap rates range from 3.5% to 7.95%, and the median is 4.75 to 5.45. As I say in bold, traditional apartment buildings, not independent living facilities, because they don't have data. I then talk about the increasing cost of borrowing. And I won't belabor this, but if you look at the chart on page 10, you can see how dramatically the Bank of Canada rate increased, and it went up by 425 basis points between April of 2021 and April of 2023, the reference date. Why does that matter? Because interest rates impact capitalization rates. So I'll tie it all together, but that's why I'm telling you this. Page 11, more information about the relationship between bond rates and mortgage rates. On to page 12. Here's a chart published by CBRE that tells us that cap rates are increasing. We can see the swing up in cap rates. Then at page 13, I start to talk about factors that impact capitalization rates. So things like the building type and the type of construction. And to be clear, these are well constructed. I'm not saying for a moment that these are not well constructed. Does it have heritage status? None of these do. We can pass that by. The amenities in the building, in-suite laundry, balconies and outdoor spaces, office space, business space, gyms, pet friendly. So obviously, these are not fully equipped, I'll use the phrase, in the sense of being comparable to typical apartments. The durability and quality of the income. Well, when your vacancy bounces around a fair bit, that tells you that your income might be at risk to some extent to external events. Age of the building. These are not old buildings. They're all relatively, 15 years, probably is the oldest in that range. Some a little bit newer. Condition of the buildings. Again, they are more than reasonably looked after. I'm not going to suggest to you there's an issue there. Parking. The ratio of the number of parking spaces to the number of suites. Let's assume hypothetically, the operator of this business no longer wants to be in the independent living accommodation business. They're going to sell it. Any one of you, me, the market generally is going to buy it. How do you buy a building that's got one parking stall for every 4 units? You can see there that in Winnipeg, the zoning bylaw speaks to a stall and a half for every unit. Here, we've got one stall for every 4 units. That's a big negative, I'll suggest to you, to the marketability of the product in the marketplace, and it has an impact ultimately on the capitalization rate. The suite mix. High proportion of bachelors, high proportion of ones. Those are less desirable. 2 bedrooms are always more desirable for a number of reasons. One of them is people can share. Friends can share the cost of an apartment. And also, when you have a high proportion of 1-bedroom units, your rent potential is lower. Your upside rent potential is lower. Suite size, smaller suites typically are less desirable. So they're going to be at greater risk in terms of rentability. Newer apartments, as I said earlier, tend to have smaller suites, but they give you more space by way of common areas. The number of suites, these are all larger buildings. These are all north of 100 building units. Some of them are closer to 100. Some of them are much closer to 200. And then location. And of course, in bold at the bottom of the page, the obvious factor, the absence of full kitchen facilities in all of the units. So then I look to the capitalization rate information that's out there. Altus has published a study. Here's a study they've published, and you see it summarized on page 16. And essentially, they're saying if it's built 2005 plus in a good location, the cap rate will range from 5 to 5.75%. Sure, again, traditional apartment buildings, not properties like the subject. Then I've got, that's actually the same series of bullets, the same list of items I've gone through. On page 17, that's an excerpt from the city's manual. And you can see there that many of the same criteria that I just mentioned, the city has spoken about as well. So at page 17 at the bottom, I say there are likely no sales of independent living facilities. Rents for independent living facilities are not easily generated. There's no model rents for the independent living facilities. Therefore, the assessor cannot extract the capitalization rate for independent living facilities. And indeed, if you just come back to page 17 for a moment, the quote about capitalization rates in the lower half of the page, that tells you how the assessor gets their capitalization rates. They use model generated net operating incomes divided by the sale prices that are time adjusted. So model generated net operating income estimates cannot get a capitalization rate for this type of property. Then I speak to the fact on page 18 that both Cushman Wakefield and CBRE report capitalization rate data for seniors housing and independent living facilities. And I'm going to show those to you, but I just reference it. Then I tell you that historically, pre-COVID, pre-run up in the interest rates, we've been here many times before, assessors and I, and historically cap rates have been in the range of 5.25% to 5.75%. The properties on the docket, as you'll see as we get to them all, range from 4.9 to 5.25. We say those are too low. So now let's turn to the brokerage independent senior capitalization rate information. So at page 19, there is Cushman Wakefield explaining what seniors housing is, what long-term care is, and indicating that seniors housing, retirement residence that provides independent assisted living and or memory care services and accommodation as part of the monthly fee, access to meals and other services, housekeeping, transportation, social and recreational activities may be provided. Typically 100% of the cost of the accommodation is paid for privately by the residents. They distinguish that from long-term care, which is nursing homes, they're pointing out, which is different. And often there is government subsidies or support for this type of facility. And they indicate that the capitalization rates for what they call senior housing A is 6.5 to 7.25. And I'll readily tell you, I consider this to be, all these facilities to be A-class facilities. They are nice, they are good in terms of their amenities and quality. CBRE provides the same similar reporting. Again, independent assisted living, multifamily, central dining facilities, other amenity spaces, residents with meals and other services, social and recreational activities to seniors 75 plus years of age. Many have trained staff to assist with activities of daily living, either throughout the building or on a separate floor or wing. Class A, they call it properties with 120 plus units. There's one that I think is just under here, but again, I consider them all Class A, built within 15 years of age. So these would be Class A's, as I said earlier, and CBRE puts their capitalization rates for the A's at 6.5 to 7.25. So what I then do is I give you a summary of all the broker rates, both for what I'll call regular multifamily and for what I'll call the independent living. So Cushman, the multi-residential, high-rise, they put it in the range of 4.75 to 5.5. The low-rise 5 to 5.75. We've just been through the Cushman seniors housing, 6.5 to 7.25. Colliers doesn't report seniors. They show 5 to 6. CBRE, again, multifamily, there's a range there. And the seniors housing over onto the next page. And then Altus, 2005 plus, 5 to 5.75. But again, what they're reporting is typical apartment buildings and not the subject. So what that then brings me to at page 21 is independent living facilities are different from traditional apartment buildings. They don't have full kitchens. They don't have stoves. They don't have wiring for stoves. They have a smaller fridge. They have a sink, but there's no dishwasher. And there's no washer or dryer in these units. They're not rentable at the same rate as traditional apartment buildings. The pool of renters who will take a building without a full kitchen is much reduced and limited, I would suggest. The limited pool of renters will create issues in terms of achievable rents, but also in terms of potential vacancy, and expenses of operation will be higher, wider hallways, some items, handrails, intercoms, things like that, that are unique to a facility of this type. So all of that to say what I've said already, you can't just take a typical market apartment building capitalization rate and transplant it into this type of property. So I say to you, they're different. They're intended for this business use. And I ultimately suggest that you fix the capitalization rate at 6%. That then turns into a value of $15,389,000. And let me now take you through some of my attachments, which will include the spreadsheet that shows you that. So page 23 is a photo of this facility with some of their information about what's in them. And page 24 is some information about the suites. As I mentioned, private wheelchair accessible bathrooms with walk-in showers. Page 25 speaks about the activities that are offered in these facilities, as well as the weekly housekeeping service that's available. Page 26 speaks about the security and safety features that are available, 24-hour on-site assistance, security cameras, safety checks, wide and well-lit hallways with grab rails, wheelchair accessibility. So that's what makes these facilities different and in many ways more expensive to operate than traditional apartments. Page 27 is the assessor's calculation, which she has walked you through. Page 29 is my spreadsheet. So what I have done here, and remember what I explained earlier, I took the average of the CMHC rates for the different types of units. And that's found at page 6 if you want to make a note. But I took the average of the geographic area, zone, age, and size of building. And I made a deduction of 20% to account for the differences. And that then drives the rents that you see on this spreadsheet. I've used a 7% vacancy for the reasons I've explained. I'm at a 52% expense ratio compared to the assessor's 49.1, and I'll show you something in regard to that in a moment. That gets me to a net operating income of $923,000. I capitalize at 6%, and that becomes $15,389,000. Page 30 is the expenses for 4 years. And to be clear, I've removed meals. I've removed what I'll call staffing personnel for an independent facility. It's utilities, it's repair and maintenance, it's snow and waste, it's a caretaker, it's maintenance supplies, it's property taxes, it's property management, and I put that in bold because what I do ultimately is I take 5% of my effective gross income, as you can see on that chart, and I tell you then that the ratio in 2022 was 57.11%, in 21 it was 52.54, and I select 52%. What then follows at page 31 through 41 through 40 is questionnaires. It's the source of the data that I've utilized with respect to the expenses. It comes out of these questionnaires. What follows lastly for the balance of the brief is the article that I referenced earlier about how you value congregate care facilities. And yes, it's all well and good to use proxy rents, I'll call it, rents from apartment buildings, but they better be the same facility, an equivalent facility. And when they're not, you need to make an adjustment. And I think that's the issue here. No adjustment has been made. So I've been long. I appreciate that. I promise not to repeat this. But this gives you the full picture on how I've approached these properties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
I do. I'm just wondering, do you know if the furniture is included in the rent?
No, residents bring their own furniture.
Okay. So considering the demographic for the clients for these, I guess, assisted living facilities, would you agree that the building would encounter less wear and tear?
Well, I
Compared
guess there's a couple of ways to look at that. You'd like to think that an older crowd, if I can say it that way, and I count myself amongst that, might be a little more responsible, a little gentler on premises. But having said that, there are mobility issues for many of them. And so there's canes and there's walkers and there's other things. So things will get bumped and things will get banged up. Hard one for me to say. I think it might sort of wash out, gentler users, but still things will happen. So I think repair and maintenance is likely to be similar.
Okay. So for these amenities that you're mentioned for the subject property, increased security features, I guess some activities or I guess I'm just wondering, So you don't think these features would add value to the subject property?
They add value and are integral for the business operation that's carried on in the subject facilities. Traditional apartment buildings don't have call bells or call devices in the units where you can call the central office if you need help. They're unique to this type of facility. So sure, it's necessary for the business operation of this facility. I don't think it's at all necessary and would add value to a traditional apartment.
So I guess you want to use 80% of the CMHC value. So typically for the city, we use about 80% of the CMHC to value Manitoba housing. So would you consider the subject property would be in a similar condition as the Manitoba housing properties to use 80% of the CMHC average?
I'd be surprised if they were in the same condition as Manitoba housing. I would assume they're in better condition. But I would also believe that and I don't know which of the CMHC metrics you're using on Manitoba housing, because I don't do them, but a lot of Manitoba housing is located in geographic zones where I think the rent is at a lesser level. So when you use 80% of the locations where the subject properties are, you're getting a higher base that you're working from, and so 80% is going to be much higher.
Okay. Are you aware of any Manitoba housing properties in Tuxedo area?
Yes, I am, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the value that you're asking for the rent, so I guess you include the article regarding to we should be looking for similar property types to analyze the rent. So would you have any assisted living facilities from Winnipeg region to support the value you're asking for?
Comparable assessments you're suggesting?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you asking me if there are comparable assessments in the
No.
Winnipeg area?
No, I'm asking if you have any comparable rent from the Winnipeg region to support the rent that you are asking for.
Well, that's the difficulty. The rents always include other services.
Okay. So on page 29, does your rent include parking?
My rents are driven by CMHC.
Okay, so there's no parking, like additional parking income in your workup.
Ms. Tang, was that a question for Mr. Newman?
Yeah, so I'm just saying there's no parking revenue for the subject property in the to calculate the total revenue.
Yeah, I took that as your affirmation that once I told you I use CMHC, you were affirming that therefore there was no parking included in the CMHC base numbers.
Okay. So do you know how your number would change if you do include parking in your calculation?
I don't think it's going to change very much considering the age of the residents and the fact that there's only 46 parking stalls.
Okay. And on page I guess 31 of your brief that shows the 2022 December 31st income and expense mailer. I can't really see the net operating income. I just want to confirm. Is it the net operating income $2,554,642.
It is. But to
Okay.
be clear, let's be clear about something though. What they have reported is the revenues and expenses of the business.
Okay.
So if an occupant pays $3,000 a month for a unit, that's included in the residential revenue at line 105,
Okay.
just so we're clear.
Okay. And for your cap rate study, on page 20, so you show that there's a range. So if I'm using the actual net operating income of that 2,554,000, and I use the highest cap rate of 9%, that gives me a value of about 25 million, which is still higher compared to our assessed value. I'm
That's
just
an
wondering if you have any
Yeah, I
comments.
do have a comment. That's an improper comparison, and you would have known that when you asked the question, because you're using the income of the business.
Yes, but during your presentation, I thought we were supposed to be using this as a package, which includes the services.
No.
And these cap rate studies, when they're calculating the cap rate, they do use the whole package as the income, and the income from the residents and the income from the services to calculate the cap rate. So if I'm using the same methodology that they are using to calculate their cap rate on the subject property, I'll be using the actual net operating income of the subject property and use the cap rate study that you provided in your study, and that would give me an actual valuation for the subject property. So even though I'm using the highest 9%, that would still give me about $25 million for the valuation.
To be clear, if you go with $25 million, you're not valuing real estate. You're valuing an operating business as a going concern. So let's put that aside. And let's note that the capitalization rates reported by the broker were at 6.5%. I didn't go to 6.5%. I've come in at 6%. I've deliberately come under their rates.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
Just one quick question. Mr. Newman, you indicated that there are 46 parking spots at this property.
I did say that. In fact, I picked that up from the assessor, but when she was asking me questions about the questionnaire, I see they reference 42.
All right. And I'm just wondering, because you had indicated that you had visited the property, are those 42 spots for the resident parking, or are they for staff and visitors, or they're a combination of all three?
Combination.
All right, thank you. That's all my questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Linklater. Ms. Anderson?
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Newman. My question relates as well to page 31, the return. There's income in the first column there related to laundry and to other residential hotel. And so I'm just wondering what that would relate to. Would it be the residents doing their own laundry?
So what they in the printed material that I showed you from each of the facilities, you'll see a reference to the fact that they provide laundry service. So essentially, they'll do your laundry for you at a charge.
Oh, okay.
So that's the revenue from that. And the other thing that many buildings now have, the newer buildings, is they have a guest suite.
Right.
And so if visitors are coming, they can stay in the guest suite and there'll be a charge for that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. And all the other questions I had have been asked and answered. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Newman, my question relates to this. You discounted CMHC rents by 20%. Why 20?
Well, I'll start by recognizing, to some extent, it's an arbitrary number. But having said that, my thought process was that, again, it's the absence of those, I'm going to call them amenities, but we don't call a stove or a dishwasher necessarily an amenity in a higher end building. It's a requirement, it's expected. Similarly, a washer and dryer in the suite. And in my mind, I'm going through a process of saying, okay, if I'm taking a unit without these things, I'm going to pay less rent. I'm not going to pay the same amount. And how am I going to get to it? And I attempted to be reasonable. I kicked around some numbers in my head, and ultimately I settled on 20%. And admittedly, it's my selection, and I can't say to you, here's where I get it from, but it's what I did.
You had mentioned previous municipal board rulings or decisions. Was that 20% acknowledged as something reasonable in those?
So what happened is when those cases went to the board 15 to 20 years ago, because this was a new animal in the marketplace at that point rather, nobody really knew how to value them. And so there were a variety of different methodologies. I actually used to put into my briefs the 3 decisions, but over the last couple of cycles, I started to cull it down a little bit because the methodology actually became pretty settled in the sense of go to the market, look for proxy rents. The real point of dispute has been the adjustment for the absence of those kitchen, washer, dryer type things and what the cap rate should be. So in those earlier decisions, that wasn't the approach.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, would you like summation?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newman.
I'm fine.
Okay, thank you. That concludes item number 1, and I think as we had discussed, we spent a lot of time on item number 1, got out all the issues that likely pertain to the whole docket, so the rest of them should go a little faster, I would think. Okay, Ms. Tang, if you would like to begin with item number 2, file number 24-3121, please.
Sorry, excuse me, Madam Chair. Could we take a very quick 3-minute break?
Sure, that's a good time to do it before we start. Okay.
3 minutes?
Says for 3 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We're now beginning with item number 2 on our docket, file number 24-3121. Ms. Tang, when you are ready, please.
File number is 24-3121. Roll number is 050094241615. Address is 2701 Scotia Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $24,904,000. So there's one building with 4 stories. The building was built in 2015. There are a total of 180 suites, 92 outdoor parking. Page 2 and 3 of my brief shows the subject property photos and locations. And page 4 shows that there was no sales history 3 years prior to the report. And page 5 shows the workup for the valuation. So there are 171 1-bedroom and 9 2-bedrooms. And then we assign a monthly rent of $1,129.16. The apartment, the valuation was split between, then was assigned a 3% vacancy rate, 47.23% expense ratio, and 5.25% cap rate. And that gives us $23,780,000. Then we made an adjustment of $1,124,000, and that gives us a total of $24,904,000. Page 6 of my brief shows the comparable rent for the property. And page 7 and 8 shows the CMHC information. Again, the bottom page 8 is the post-reference information. The one bedroom apartment, again, based on CMHC, is $1,171, and for the two bedroom is $1,443. On page 9 and 10 of my brief shows the cap rate studies, and page 16 of my brief shows the income submitted by the owner, and that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman, questions for Ms. Tang?
Page 5. So again, absolutely everything on the page is model driven.
That's correct.
The adjustment of $1,124,000, what is that for?
It's for the access land.
But you got no land comparables, no information in terms of how it's arrived at, correct?
That is correct.
And the rent here is $1,129. And just by way of comparisons, the rent at 50 Ridgecrest was $1,199, correct?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
The rent here, the average rent per unit is $1,129.16.
That's correct.
And at Ridgecrest, the adjacent property, because this property is immediately adjacent to the prior property, correct?
That's correct.
So the rent at that one was $1,199, correct?
That's correct.
And any idea why the model would spit out different numbers like that for immediately adjacent premises?
I think it's because there are more one-bedroom suites in this property, 2701 Scotia Street, less two-bedroom units.
Okay. And similarly, when we look at your comparables on page 6, comparables 1 and comparable 3 are again 100% two-bedroom units.
That is correct.
And the subject property, if we look at page 5, 171 units out of 180 units are one bedrooms. By my calculator, that's about 95%. Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions for the assessor?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions, thank you.
Thank you, and neither do I. Mr. Newman?
So again, same approach. I won't repeat all the detail. But I tell you on page 2 that there are what I call 72 bachelor units, and I'll explain that in a moment. No washers, dryers. The $1,124,000, I expect it's in relation to land, but we don't know how that value is arrived at. If we jump ahead to page 5, here's where I begin to talk about the rents. And at page 6, I talk about, if you go the 4th paragraph down, the questionnaire reports 72 bachelor units. And I say that's not because of their size, but because of the complete absence of kitchen facilities. And so I need to explain something here. And what I need to explain is that when it was constructed, it was their intention to have units available for individuals with Alzheimer's or dementia. And for that reason, they put absolutely no kitchen facilities into those units. It turned out that that program wasn't well received in the marketplace. And so eventually they put kitchenettes into those units. And so at page 7, when I say they're called bachelors, but because of the complete absence of kitchen facilities, that's how it started. But I want to make it clear that it changed. And if you look to page 7 at the bottom, the 72 units which initially had no kitchen facilities, those were changed and kitchenettes have been put in place, but vacancy continues to be high. And so let me just stay on page 8 for the moment. You can see what the vacancy statistics look like historically. They've had issues in this facility, and I know the assessor has said that she believes demand is high. It's not always high. And in fact, they had issues in this facility for a good number of years. So let's then come back to the rents. Let's come back to page 7. And again, what I've done is I've done the same concept. I've gone to CMHC as my starting point. I've made the 20% adjustment. That changes my potential income compared to the assessors. And I'll take you to the spreadsheet to show it to you. But I've done conceptually the same thing. On to page 8, level of expenses, 47.23% used by the assessor. And I'll mention to you now that as we look at the other properties, you're going to see expense ratios starting with a 5. But I'll just mention to you that's what this one is as assigned by the assessor. Again, I've done the same analysis and I'm stabilizing at 52%. And again, I will show you the chart to show it to you numerically. So same comments about COVID. Same, I get to page 10. It's the same commentary about the cap rate. And that carries through to page 22, where I summarize the capitalization rates made available by the various sources. And then at the bottom half of page 22, I again make reference to those factors that I referred to earlier. No full kitchen, no washer dryer, not rentable at the same rate as traditional apartment buildings. Pool of renters is smaller, creates issues in terms of rent or potentially vacancy. Expenses of operation are higher. High preponderance of 1-bedroom units here. Assessor comparables have got, I'll suggest, a high preponderance of 2-bedroom units. And so ultimately, I fix a value of 16 million, bottom page 23. I fix a value of $16,286,000. I'll show you in a moment how I get to that. And then I have some discussion about the land value. So I say I don't know how the assessor's gotten there, and as we've noted, she's provided no information. But what's not taken into account clearly is you can't just sell this piece of land, because it's all one parcel of land from a legal perspective. So if you want to sell this piece of land, you have to do a subdivision. When you do a subdivision, you have to pay a dedication fee to the city of Winnipeg. And that dedication fee is 10% of the value of the parcel that's being created through the subdivision. There would be a brokerage commission. There would be the cost of the subdivision, survey, legal, and land title registration fees. And so ultimately, I suggest taking all of that into account, there should be an adjustment of 20% of the value to take into account those items, recognizing that 10% will go immediately to the city by way of a dedication fee. And therefore, I'm suggesting the land value should be $899,000. Keeping in mind, we have no information from the assessor as to how it's arrived at. And so then what I do ultimately is I take my improvement value, which I'll show you in a moment, plus the land value, and I say that comes out to $17,185,000. Let me then just skip you quickly through some of the attachments. Page 25 is a photo of the facility. Again, page 26 and following, you've got some of the online information that the facility publishes about what's available. Many of these facilities offer what I'll call different programs. You can be living in one of these units. You might have to be in a memory unit, for example, which is essentially a locked facility because unfortunately you wander. So there's a variety of different types of programs that are available. Housekeeping, page 29, page 30, the safety and security. Page 31 and 2 is the assessor's calculation. And now let me take you to page 33. So here's my calculation. And what you can see is what I called the bachelor earlier. Even though at one point they had absolutely nothing by way of kitchen facilities, I'm actually putting them at the same rent as the one bedroom, because they do have the limited kitchen facilities that the other units have. So I'm putting them at the same rental level. And then there's the 2 bedrooms. And again, all of that is driven by the CMHC adjusted by 20%. I've moved the vacancy to 7%, keeping in mind the historic. I've got the expense ratio at 51%. The NOI is $977,000. Capping at 6 is $16,286,000. And then I would add to that, round numbers, $899,000 for the land value. And it gets you to the $17,185,000 I referenced earlier. Page 34 is the expense ratio calculation. Again, it's all the same data. It's all the food related. It's the personnel related, except for a caretaker. It's everything of that type removed to leave you with what I consider to be real estate related expenses. And then I'm determining the expense ratio by using my effective gross income, and notwithstanding what it's appearing at 61 and 53%, I'm stabilizing at 51%. That compares with the assessor's 47.23. And then what follows are the questionnaires, which are the source of the information. And then again, at the end, the same article that you saw in the prior hearing. So that would complete my submission. I am open to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
Yeah, I guess I just have the questions on the land value. So I guess you did indicate on your page 24 that the city assessed the land at $16.05 per square foot for the access land. And then I guess so I guess in the paper it says the minimum 10% value should be deducted. So I'm just wondering if you would have any land comparables to support that value.
No, what I've done simply is I've accepted your value as the starting point. But I've recognized you can't sell this piece of land without doing a subdivision. And as part of the subdivision, you have to pay 10% to the city of Winnipeg, plus all the other costs that will be associated.
So you did mention that there has been some changes to the subject property because the dementia care was not very successful for the subject property. So they converted into, so they add some kitchen facilities into the property.
They added, I'll call them kitchenettes. They added what is in all the other units into those 72 units. They didn't add a separate kitchen. They just put the limited facilities into those units.
So it sounds like they're very easily converted between, I guess, to remove the kitchenette and to add the kitchenette back into the facility then.
Well, certainly you can remove some cabinetry or millwork. You can do that. You can wheel a fridge out, you can do that. What you can't do without a lot of work is put wiring in to handle a stove or a dryer. That's a major undertaking, and that's why you can't convert these to what I'll call regular apartments.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Ms. Anderson, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
No, I have no questions. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
I have no questions for Mr. Newman, but could I redirect to the assessor?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Tang, I believe you stated at the beginning of this hearing that you did not inspect any of these properties, correct?
That is correct.
So have you ever been in a 55+ building in the city at all?
No.
All right. I thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Newman, you have a different suite mix than the assessor. Notwithstanding your clarification around bachelor and 1-bedroom, you have 157, we'll call them 1-bedrooms.
Yeah.
To Ms. Tang's 171, and many more 2-bedrooms than her 9, 21 to 9. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and I'm just looking for it because what they did is somewhere along the way, they took 2 units, and I remember this discrepancy, if I can call it that, has come up before. Somewhere along the way, they took 2 units and they converted them into common areas, activity rooms essentially, and that's why the numbers are different.
That would explain the difference in numbers of suites,
Yeah,
but I'm talking about the suite mix.
yeah. Yeah, and I can tell you that as I was preparing these briefs, I went back to ownership and I sought confirmation and clarification that what they had reported in the questionnaire in fact was accurate, and I received that confirmation.
Okay, that was one of the questions. You'd indicated that approximately 20% of the assessor's value on the land should be deducted. Would that only be the case if there is an interest in selling? Has there been an interest in selling?
I think people have nosed around from time to time. So if you look at the assessor's overhead photo, which appears on page 2 of her brief. So you can see the open area of land, and to be clear, you'll see 2 open areas of land. So one is to the left of a roadway that ends in a cul-de-sac. Right, and one is to the right. The land we're talking about is the land to the left.
The big square
The
there?
big square, that's what we're talking about here, as opposed to the smaller square that's to the right. And so, yes, people do come around from time to time, but ownership has not made a decision yet as to whether they're interested in selling.
So I guess my question is if they haven't indicated an interest in this time in selling, is it still reasonable to make deductions for those things?
Well,
Is the value still then?
so my attitude would be, and this gets into the concept of excess or surplus land. And so, you know, typically, depending on the use of the property, there's a typical ratio of land to building. And when that ratio is higher, then the assessor will sometimes express the view that there's excess or surplus land and put a value on it by way of adjustment. I don't quarrel with the concept of putting a value on it, but I do say the value needs to be correct. And the only way this can be sold is if the subdivision is done. And as soon as you do a subdivision, the dedication fee comes from the city at 10%. And it's not 10% of the value. that the city puts on it now. It's 10% of the subdivided value, which will be based on the proposed use and zoning. So it might not be simply $1,114,000 or $1,112,000, which I think is what 10% of $1,124,000 is. It might actually be higher. But what I'm saying simply is if you take the 10% into account and take into account all the other costs that will be associated with the process, I take it down to round numbers, $900,000.
Thank you very much. Summation, go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
With apologies, is it all right if I ask one more question to
Of course.
Mr. Newman? Thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry. Just in regards to the addition of the small kitchen area to those bachelor suites, did that happen like before they were opening in 2017?
No, it happened after they opened. Because again, the take up or the attractiveness of those programs in the marketplace didn't turn out to be, and they had they weren't just attracting occupants, and so they decided to change the format of them.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for that. That's all my questions.
Thank you. Summation, Ms. Tang.
It's like it's.
I think you're frozen, Ms. Tang. I'll send her an email. She might not be able to hear us. Yeah. She needs to log out and.
It works pretty good, all things considered, I
Yeah.
have to say. The
Yeah.
glitches aren't that frequent. Spoke too soon.
To suggest that she appear just by audio. Where's that? Oh, yeah, that'll be fine.
So my block at the read for tomorrow morning. I've got Jamie Fougere sending me emails. It's a very responsible guy. I think he's run office.
She's just logged off. See, it works, but it's not magic. Sometimes if the internet connection's down, I
We're just going to recess for a couple minutes until we get this figured out. Let's call the meeting back to order. We had just completed item number 2. Now moving to item number 3, 24-3122. Ms. Tang, when you are ready, please.
File number is 24-3122. Roll number is 0743863060. Address is 10 Hollandquist Drive. The assessed value for 2025 is 17,442,000. There's one building on the property with 4 stories. The building was built in 2005. There are 126 suites, 8 indoor parking, and 16 outdoor parking. Page 2 and 3 of my brief shows the subject property photos and locations. And page 4 shows that there was no sales history. Page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are a total of 118 one-bedroom, 8 two-bedrooms. And then we use a monthly rent of $1,133.81. Then we use 2.6% vacancy, 45.16% expense ratio, and 5.25% cap rate. And that gives us 17,442,000. Page 6 shows the comparable rent and photos. Page 7 and 8 shows the CMHC information. And 9 and 10 shows the cap rate studies. And page 16 is the income expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman, questions for Ms. Tang?
Ms. Tang, the page 5, again, all model driven.
That's correct.
And again, a very high proportion of 1-bedroom units in this complex, correct?
That's correct.
So the expense ratio is 45.16%. The last 2 properties we did were 49.1 and 47.23% respectively. This is the oldest of the properties we're going to do today. And any idea why the expense ratio is the lowest?
I think it might because the total suite is the lowest as well. So this one has a total of 126 suites, and the other ones are all higher compared to this property.
Okay, I would have thought actually the opposite might be the case, that when you have a larger number of units, sometimes you have a greater economy of scale. And when you have a smaller number, you have the opposite, and therefore the expense ratio might be higher. Any observation or comment on that?
No, I don't have any comments on that one.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, questions for the assessor?
Yes, thank you. In regards to the vacancy rate, it too is lower than the percentage is 2.6, and the previous 2 properties we looked at, they were 3%. And I'm just wondering if you can comment as to why the vacancy percentage would be lower.
I think it's because of different region of the property. So the previous 2 properties are in region 6 according to CMHC, and this property is in region 5 according to CMHC. So different regions does have different vacancy rate.
So a different region within the city of Winnipeg.
That is correct, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. That's my only question.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions either, Ms. Chang, so thank you. Mr. Newman?
Yes, I'll be efficient. Page 2, some of the background of the property again. It's the same concept. It's exactly the same concept as the others. If we jump to page 4, there we see the indication of the assessor's average rent of $1,133 a unit. My methodology remains the same. I look to the rents for 1 and 2 bedroom units at page 5 in St. James, and based on year of construction and based on structure size, number of units. There's the average, and then there's the average less 20%, so it's the same concept again. And I'll show you the spreadsheet, but essentially my gross potential income becomes $1,317,000 compared with the assessor's $1,714,000. Vacancy, 2.6% allowed. There's the historic vacancy over the last 4 years. I've gone to 7%. Expenses, 45.16 is utilized. It's interesting, in 23, the expense ratio was 47.12%. As buildings get older, the expenses don't typically go down. At the end of the day, I've left it, and I'll show you the spreadsheet in a moment, but I've used 47%, even though it's considerably higher, but again, I'll show it to you in a moment. The same capitalization rate information is found at pages 8 through 20. And then on page 21, I get to my conclusion, which is $10,819,000. Page 22 is a photo of the property. So you can see what it looks like. At page 23 through 25, there's a bit of a story about the property, the suites, the activities, the housekeeping, the security and safety items, the assessor's calculation at page 26 and 27. Page 28 is my spreadsheet with my calculation. And again, my CMHC average rents less 20%, with a 7% vacancy, with a 47% expense ratio, with a 6% cap, $10,819,000. Page 29 is my expense ratio calculation. Again, using my effective gross income, and you can see it's coming out at 68 and 42%. And I've stabilized at, as I told you, at 47%. And then you've got the questionnaires, which are the source of that information. And then you've got the article again at the end. And that's my submission, open for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
I have no questions.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will conclude item number 3. We'll move to item number 4, file number 24-3124. Ms. Tang.
File number is 24-3124. Roll number is 0743863460. Address is 707 Center Street. The assessed value for 2025 is $15,461,000. There's one building with 4 stories. It was built in 2007. There are a total of 153 suites and 51 outdoor parking. Page 5 of my brief shows the evaluation. So there are a total of 131 bedroom, 23 2 bedrooms, and we assign monthly rent of $948. And then we use 2.6% vacancy, 52.12% expense ratio, and 5.25% cap rate. and that gives us 15,461,000. And page 6 is the comparables, and 7 and 8 is the CMHC information. Page 9 and 10 is the capitalization rate studies, and page 16 is the income and expense information. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman.
So this property at 707 Setter is immediately adjacent to the immediately preceding property at 10 Allenquist, correct?
Yes.
So here we have a 52.12% expense ratio. And the other one was what it was. Here we have a rent of $948. And all the prior ones have been north of $1,100. Any idea why?
The size is a little bit smaller compared to the previous property. So for this one, we assigned a gross floor area per unit with a 787 square foot. And the previous property, we assigned 833 square foot.
So you're saying that because the units are smaller, you believe that's generating a different rent?
That is correct.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions, thank you.
Ms. Tang, are you saying, like, I know you looked at comparables, look at the gross square feet per unit, but did you actually look at the unit itself? Are these individual units smaller than the other ones?
I'm not too sure about each size like each suite type per se. We just like I guess when we were calculating the gross floor area per unit, we just used the I guess we did take into consideration of the common area.
Right.
So then we just assign I guess the value to each unit.
So it would be, so perhaps the common areas are smaller also. That could possibly be the explanation too.
It's possible, yeah, because we like I mean the value does include the common areas, so we don't like I don't know exactly what the division is between the two, like what made up this 787 square foot.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman.
So again, similar presentation. If we jump ahead in my brief to page 3. You can see that I'm accepting the rents here. So we don't have a disputes about the potential income. And you can see at the bottom of page 4 that and on to page 5, the vacancy was 3.2. I've moved the vacancy a little bit, 4% based on the history. You can see the level of expenses of the assessor. I've accepted that. And so that brings us down ultimately to the capitalization rate. And if you jump to page 25, there you see my spreadsheet, where I use the assessor's potential income and a 4% vacancy and a 52.12% expense ratio, which is the assessor's expense ratio, comes out to $800,000 of net operating income capitalized at 6, results in the value presented. All the other same materials are in the brief, and that would complete my submission.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
No questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Linklater? You are,
Sorry about that.
that's okay.
A little technical issue. I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, questions for Mr. Newman?
My only question is in regards to the vacancy rate that you've applied, the 4%. So you indicated that's based on the actual vacancies?
Well, what I did is I looked at the history, because typically I've looked at 4 years of history.
Yeah,
And in this property, it was bouncing around a little bit. And this is detailed at my page. At my page 5. And so that's why I went up slightly.
okay, okay. Any comment on why it might be that this property would have a lower vacancy than the adjacent property, like the last property that we looked at, or?
I don't have a good answer. I mean, obviously, these were built at slightly different points in time. And I've been in both of them again. They're very similar. They're a little bit different. The one thing I will say is that generally speaking, they work to a template in the sense of plans. Obviously, the number of units will vary, but certainly in terms of their design, they attempt to be as consistent as possible because it allows them to standardize their operations. Their unit sizes are very, very similar to each other, and I know that arose in the context of why the rent is lower, and the question of the gross square footage and the common area perhaps fitting into that. But in terms of the vacancy, it can, maybe a lot of people got sick. Maybe there was a lull in demand for space. They calculate their vacancy each month. And so the figure they submit is a monthly calculated, annualized calculation that they provide. Because I wanted to make sure I understood that as well before I came here. It's just the vagaries of what happens.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. That's my only question.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Newman, you did mention about the smaller or possible smaller unit size, but are they the same size as the previous types? The previous ones we've seen?
Yes, in a general sense, they are.
Okay. I have no additional questions. That concludes item number 4. We will move to item number 5, file number 24-3123. Go ahead, Ms. Tang.
File number is 24-3123. Roll number is 0802113580. Address is 1015 St. Anne's Road. The assessed value for 2025 is $21,466,000. Again, there's one building with 4 stories. The building was built in 2009. There are 168 suites with 8 indoor parking and 70 outdoor parking. Page 5 shows the evaluation. So there are 141 bedroom and 28 2-bedrooms. And we assign monthly rent of $1,157.19. We use 3.6% vacancy, 53.23% expense ratio, and 4.9% cap rate. And that gives us $21,466,000. The property is in Zone 10 according to CMHC. And page 16 is the income expense information, and that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman.
So, leaving aside the rent, which is different on this one again, the expense ratio is 53.23. I think that's ultimately going to be the highest of the bunch. Let's leave that aside. The cap rate is 4.9. So here we've got a cap rate that's 35 basis points less than for the properties we've dealt with already. Any idea why?
I think it might just because of the location of the property. This one is in Cemetery area compared to the previous two that is in St. James and West Kildonan. So I guess we're assigning a lower cap rate for this property compared to the other four.
The assessor's model, more generally, the cap rates the assessor presents. Certainly the brokers don't break it down by geographic area, is that correct?
That is correct.
And so you're speculating that maybe it's got something to do with the geographic area, but I'm gathering you don't actually know whether that's the case. Is that fair?
The CMHC is breaking down the range based on the regions. So I think it is reasonable that we're breaking down the cap rate based on the regions as well.
But again, you don't know. You're speculating.
I think we have enough studies we're collecting enough income expense information from the owners across the city to determine the value is different based on different regions. That's why the model assigned different values for different regions.
The model assigns different rental values, you're saying.
No, the cap rate.
Well, but again, I come back to, you're speculating, you don't actually know that, is that correct?
I guess it's not speculating. I guess it's just what the model does, because we are collecting the information from citywide and we are dividing them based on the regions. So the subject property is in region 10. So we will be looking at the income and expense information from the area to determine what the cap rate would be. And then we assign the value based on the studies that we have done through the income and expense questionnaires that we received.
But again, that's, as we've discussed, that's a model for traditional apartments and not a model for independent living, right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, let's leave it there.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, do you have questions for the assessor?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
I also have no questions. Thank you.
Okay, and neither do I, so thank you. Mr. Newman?
Again, similar presentation. So if we jump ahead to and can I just make a more general observation? Each of the briefs I present provides information about the square footage of the units. And I know we asked about that before, and I'm just mentioning it. I don't really think it's been a focus of what we've done, but I have collected the data over the years. And were you to look at the first page of each of my briefs for each of the properties, you'll see slightly different square footages. But again, they're pretty consistent in terms of their range. Okay, so having said that, let's jump to bottom of page 4 onto page 5. So again, we've got a challenge to the rent here at $1,157. And again, on page 6, I've got the calculation looking at the three metrics, the geographic area, the year of construction, and the number of units in the building. And then I average those. on page 6, in the middle of the page, the average is stated to be 771.66 for the 1 bedrooms. That's an error. That's 1171.66, and the correct number appears immediately below it. So I'm just pointing that out. Then the 20% subtraction, the 3.6% vacancy, it's accepted. The 53.23% expense ratio, it's accepted. So that brings us to the capitalization rate. And again, we go through the brief and we get to page 21, and I'm concluding 6%. And then I'll take you to the spreadsheet to show you the calculation of value. Page 22, there's a photo of the facility. Page 23 and 24 and 25, again, some discussion about the amenities, the assessor's calculation on 26 and 27. Page 28 is the spreadsheet, and you can see how the values arrived at. So the rents are different than the assessors, the vacancy, the expense ratio, it's same, and then the capitalization rate is 6%, of course. And that's what I've got for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
Just one question. So I guess on page 2 of your brief, it says that there is an average of 30% of units turnover each year, and you're accepting our model vacancy of 3.6%.
Yes,
Okay, no further questions.
but just to be clear, turnover means somebody leaves and somebody new comes in. That's all it's intended to reflect. And as I said earlier, every time you've got turnover, that turns into an expense potentially. Sometimes you've got to repaint a unit because the prior tenant has left scuffs or whatever. But that's what that is, and that's a function simply of the age of the residents. Regrettably, a number of them move on for different reasons.
Okay, but you accept our 3.6% vacancy.
I do, yes.
No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
I have no questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions either. So that will conclude item number 5. Item number 6 on our agenda is file number 24-3528. Ms. Tang.
File number is 24-3528. Roll number is 030800220000. Address is 1778 Pembina Highway. The assessed value for 2025 is $21,732,000. There are 2 buildings, and they range between 4 stories and 8 stories. The building was built in 2008. There are a total of 215 suites and 30 outdoor parking. Page 5 of my brief shows the evaluation. So there are a total of 96 bachelor suites, 99 1-bedroom, 22 bedrooms, and then we assign monthly rent of $903.56. The property is split between 20T and 40S. The 40S is for the memory care, is for the personal care portion, and the 20T is for the assisted living portion. So we assign vacancy rate of 3.1%, and then we use the expense ratio of 51.47%, and we use a 4.9% for the assisted living for a portion and 5.25% for the personal care portion. And that gives us a total valuation of $21,732,000. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman, questions for Ms. Tang?
So page 5, again, all model driven, correct?
That's correct.
You show the average monthly rent as being $903.56. That's a combined blended average monthly rent, correct?
That's correct.
The units in the 40S, I know you haven't been there, but you've seen photos in my brief, correct?
Yes,
They're essentially hotel rooms, aren't they?
yes.
And for the 40S, we've got a cap rate of 5.25%. And for the 20T, we've got a cap rate of 4.9%. Right?
That's correct.
All right, those are my questions.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, questions for Ms. Tang?
Yes, in regards to the cap rate for the 20T and the 40S, they differ. So I'm wondering if you can tell us why that would be, why they'd be different.
Because the 40S is considered as a personal care facility, so we do take into consideration that portion is a little bit different in terms of design and square footage. So we are assigning a higher cap rate for that portion.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's my only question.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
My question was asked and answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tang, how many suites are in the 20T and how many suites are in the 40S?
Um, uh, I'm not too sure.
And Mr. Newman?
It's on page 5 of your brief. What's shown is the 96 Bachelor is the 40S, and the 99 and 20 is the 20T.
Okay, and then you've used this, all the same parameters, different rent though, right? It turns out it's different rent per suite, or have you figured that part out?
I think we would be using the same rent across for both of them.
So you're using that 903 for both?
That is correct.
Okay. I was wondering about that because I was just doing the rough numbers and I was coming up with different rents, so I didn't know. Okay. And
Madam
so
Chair?
using the same rent, you're using the same model with respect to everything except cap rate.
That's correct.
Okay. And again, it's a very low cap rate for the 20T portion. Is that, I don't know what area, part of the town that would be, Pembina, so Fort Garry, is that considered Fort Garry? It's similar to,
Let me tell you. Yeah, so that'll be Region 11 based on the CMHC. So that'll be Fort Garry.
okay,
So yeah,
okay. And on the 40S, this is a personal care home piece. Is that the cap rate, a model cap rate used for all personal care homes by the city? Or is it specific again to this, your model and how it kicks out for this one?
again, it is going to be based on the region for the
Okay,
for the property. Yes.
okay, okay, thank you, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman. Oh,
I do want to make a correction. So
okay,
it looks like we are using a higher rent for the 20T portion. So we're using $931.26 for the 20T portion. And we are using slightly lower.
869.23.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Ms. Tang. Ms. Anderson, did you have a question? I saw your hand up. No?
Oh, sorry, it was just to clarify that rent. I saw it on page 6 as well.
Okay.
9/31/26, so I was just going to indicate that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Mr. Newman.
So this one's a little different. And before I walk you through text, maybe I'm going to show you some photos and floor plans. If you look at page 26 of my brief, and they divide the different portions by name. So the 20T is called the landing, and the 40S is called Harmony Court. And so you see on page 26 floor plans for the units in the landing portion, which is the fully taxable, the independent living. And you can see there are, mostly 1 bedrooms, obviously, but there are some 2 bedrooms. And like the prior properties, they do not have full kitchen facilities. And then at page 27, you see the floor plans for the units at what's called Harmony Court. And there are some photos as well at page 28. That's a photo of the hallway in the Harmony Court 40S section. Page 29. Page 30 is taken from the doorway looking into the unit. Page 31 is further inside the unit. And page 32 is from inside the unit looking back towards the door. And there's a washroom, obviously, but this is why I describe them as essentially being like a hotel room. I think I've referred to them previously as being like a dormitory, and the assessor in her brief characterizes them as bachelor. And then continuing to turn the pages, if you look at page 33 and a couple of pages following, I'm giving you floor plans for bachelor units simply to give you examples of what bachelor units in the marketplace frequently look like. So, here's a unit at Birchwood Terrace. You can see that the kitchen has stove. Then if you look at page 34, that's called Charsdale Gardens. It indicates it's 398 square feet. And again, you can see kitchen and stove. The bedroom area accordingly apparently can be separated from the living area by a sliding partition. It's got a fridge and stove. It's got a dishwasher. So that's an example of another bachelor unit. And then page 35 is a further example of a bachelor unit, Princeton Apartments on Broadway. And again, you can see a different sort of layout, but again, there's a stove in this unit. So those are examples, and I gave them to you simply to make the distinction between what the units in Harmony Court in the 20S are and what a traditional bachelor unit looks like. I don't think these are bachelors. I think these are something different than bachelors, and I think they are different than the bachelors that CMHC would report. So having shown you those things, let's go now back into my brief. So I make reference to the independent living, 99 1 bedrooms and 20 2 bedrooms. So again, a high proportion of 1 bedroom units, the supportive living, 96 units. Again, not a traditional apartment. Page 3, I discuss what is in each of these units, and again, the independent living, the 119 units, no washer dryer, no stove, no dishwasher, and an apartment-sized fridge and microwave. The supportive living, Harmony Court. Here's the size of the units, and you can see that 82 of the units are less than 264 square feet. So a lot of smaller units. And again, what I do on page 4 is I detail the approach of the assessor. And as the assessor has noted, there are different rents for these different facilities. And I can only say appropriately so, in my opinion. They're very different from a size and amenity perspective. But 3.1% vacancy, a 51.47% expense ratio, a 5.25 cap on the one side, and a 4.9% on the other side. So the issues that I'm raising are the rental rates for the 96 unit dormitory. I'm not raising issue with the $931.26 for the 20T, the taxable portion. I am raising issue with the units for the 96 unit dormitory, and I'm taking issue with the cap rate on everything. So let's then jump ahead to page 7. Here I tell you that the gross potential income for the assessor's independent living 20T is accepted. Harmony Court, I take issue with the $869.23. I say to you, they're in essence the size of hotel rooms, single room with a bathroom, no kitchen facilities within the unit, not like a bachelor unit. Less than 50% of the size of a 1-bedroom unit. They're not true bachelors. I've given you the examples, which I've shown you already. What I then do is I go to CMHC, and on page 9, here is the data based on district, based on year of construction, and based on size of structure. And you see that the average of those 3 criteria is $903. But I again adjust by 20% because I say to you simply, they're not like other bachelor units. CMHC's market of bachelor units is of the type that I've already shown you. So that brings me to vacancy. Again, I'm accepting the 3.1%. That brings me to expenses. Again, I'm accepting the 51.47%. And that brings me back to cap rate. And again, everything I said to you previously, I would say to you again. But I would go a little bit further, and I would say to you that the supportive housing, the 40S units are completely different. They're not going to trade based on any model similar to apartments, to traditional apartments. So let me then continue through my brief. We've looked at pages 26 through 36. 36 is the assessor's calculation, and this is my habit to always handwrite on the assessor's calculation what the rents are. It's just a reference point for me. There's a little bit of the promotional literature that the operator publishes about the landing, the 20T rather, and the Harmony Court, which is the 40S. And then there is my spreadsheet, and you can see that essentially what I've done is I've accepted the assessor's rent on the 119 units and their vacancy and their expense ratio, and it really becomes an issue of the capitalization rate only, 4.9% as against 6%. And on the supportive housing, the 40S, I brought the rent down to $722. It's the average of the CMHC bachelor rates, less 20%, same expense ratio, same vacancy, and then capitalizing at 6. And so that's my different values, and the same article I referred to you to earlier is attached at the end. So that's my presentation to you, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
I guess just one. So for the 20T and the 40S portion, so these two would have different floor plan and designs. So wouldn't you think that they should be having different cap rates?
Ultimately, I don't think so. I think that at the end of the day, what's being sold, what's being put into the market is a form of housing. Both of them are different than traditional apartments in the sense that included within the rental amount is all the amenities, all the food, all the services. And so what we're back to is getting to the appropriate rent. And I appreciate that's a separate issue than the capitalization rate. But then when you start to look at where these facilities fit into the marketplace, you know, is there an argument perhaps that the PCH should be a little different? Because perhaps it's government supported. I mean, ultimately, it is reliant on government. If government policy changes, then, you know, their business model could change very quickly and very significantly. But as I say, I treated them as one on the basis that they're both being taken into the market as living facilities.
And the government is only showing support for the 40S portion, or do they support the entire facility?
No, only the 40S.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tang. Ms. Linklater, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
I have no questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And neither do I. So thank you, Mr. Newman. That will conclude item number 6. We'll now move to the last item on our agenda, item 7. File number 24-3120. Ms. Tang.
File number is 24-3120. Roll number is 100064211000. Address is 901 Shaftesbury Boulevard. The assessed value for 2025 is $21,943,000. There are 2 buildings and 2 to 3 story high, and it was built. I guess one was built in 1972 and the other one was built in 2008. There are a total of 189 suites, 3 indoor parking and 90 outdoor parking. Page 5 shows the workout valuation. So there are 19 bachelor suites, 123 1-bedroom, 46 2-bedroom, and 1 4-bedroom. And we assign an average rent of $1,047.70. So the income is split between 10T and 20T. We use a 3.4% vacancy, 51.23% expense ratio. And for the 10T portion, we use 5.35% cap rate. And for 20T, we use 5.1% cap rate. And that gives us an overall value of $21,943,000. And that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tang. Mr. Newman, do you have questions for Ms. Tang?
Page 5, again, all model driven.
That's correct.
And so that the panel understands what's called the 10T, and what's been described as a 4-bedroom. That's a house, isn't it?
It is.
Yes. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Ms. Anderson, do you have questions for Ms. Chang?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Linklater?
Yes, Ms. Tang, can you just tell me about the parking again? I missed what you said.
3 indoor parking and 90 outdoor parking.
Okay, would you happen to know where the 3 indoor parking is located?
I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you. And I have no questions for Ms. Tang, so, oh, I do. Ms. Tang, this is a different cap rate again, 5.1. Is that again because of the region, or is that number of suites? It's on the high end, like we've seen in other places where you've used a higher cap rate, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so this one will be I guess, based on the number of suites and the location of the property, and then the model assign a different cap rate based on those characteristics.
Okay, we've seen River Ridge 2 has 180 suites and it had a cap rate of 5.25. So is it safe to say that this is all about the location, this lower cap rate?
Yeah, so we do consider Assiniboine Park is considered as a better location compared to St. James or West Kildonan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Newman.
So similar to the prior presentations, if you look at page 2, and again, here's an example of the detail in terms of the size of the units. The bachelors are approximately 350 square feet. The 1 bedroom is approximately 600, but they range from 503 up to 721, of which there are 2. The 2 bedrooms are approximately 865 and range from 815 to 993, with 40 units of 839 square feet. And as I said to you earlier, I've actually been through all this detail at one point, and that's why I have this information in these briefs. The property is located on Shaftesbury. It's located adjacent to the CNR main line. The 4-bedroom or the 10T is a house that's sitting on the property. So we come to my page 4 now. So 21 of the units in this facility have absolutely no kitchen whatsoever. Those are the bachelors. They have 0. The balance have the typical limited kitchen we've been talking about. No stove, no wiring for the stove, no cooking facilities within the units. And again, just so we're clear, that's a very deliberate decision by management. Let's not put stoves into facilities with older people and create a safety issue and a safety hazard potentially. So they aren't there. And there's no wiring for them, as I've said previously. So the assessor is using an average rent of $1,046.35. And again, my approach is the same, page 6. I go back to CMHC. There are the average rates depending on the type of unit. Bachelors, 1s and 2s. And then you can see that what we call the bachelors are the ones with no kitchen whatsoever. The 1 bedrooms down to 987 and the 2 bedrooms down to 1194. And again, I'll show you the spreadsheet in a couple of moments. The vacancy Page 7, it's jumped around a little bit. We've accepted the assessor's 3.4%. Expense ratio 51.23%. Assessor, we've accepted that as well. You'll see that in the spreadsheet. We then jump ahead to the capitalization rate. And again, you've got the analysis that the brokers have done, that Altus has done, the seniors housing analysis. And my page 19 summarizes all of that and the different rates. And again, remember these facilities, wider hallways, some security type, safety type features you won't commonly find in apartment buildings. And so ultimately, I set the capitalization rate at 6% for all the reasons I've articulated. Then let's move ahead. Page 22 is a photo of the site, referencing some of the amenities and features available. That continues through page 25. Page 26 is the assessor's calculation. Page 27 is my spreadsheet. And, again, the difference here is the rents, and it's the capitalization rate. And of course, to this number of 17,901,000, we would add the value of the house at $137,000, the same article that you've seen previously. And that would be my submission, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newman. Ms. Tang, do you have questions for Mr. Newman?
Yeah, just one. So I guess for this one, your income work valuation does not include parking income.
It does not.
Okay, no further questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Linklater, questions for Mr. Newman?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions either. Before we conclude, would you like the opportunity to do a summary, Ms. Tang?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Newman?
I'll only make a couple of very brief observations. As we've gone through all of these, and as we've heard about the number of parking stalls, for example, as I said earlier, city zoning talks about a ratio, except downtown, of 1.5 stall for every unit. And people are trying to get those varied all the time, of course, because they want more density. And they want to take up, they don't want to provide more parking than they have to, because it cuts into their density. But that's the zoning requirement. Here, as we've heard frequently, on the very first one, it was 1 stall for every 4 units. Here, it's about 90 stalls, so it's about 50%. And again, that's a function of the age of the people, and a lot of them simply aren't driving anymore. We talk about parking revenue. These things aren't built and modeled around parking revenue, of course. So I think ultimately that's really not important. You've got, generally speaking, 2 core decisions. What's the rent? What's the capitalization rate? I'd leave you with that, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newman. Well, now we have heard all the items scheduled, and this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much, Ms. Tang and Mr. Newman, for your presentations today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Chair, I'll
Bye.
take this offline. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fougere has sent 15 ones.